Dr. Wexford had already started the discharge paperwork on a retired Rear Admiral's muscle strain, when the nurse standing behind him noticed the pulse in his right wrist was weaker than the pulse in his left, and understood, in the half-second it took to register that, exactly how many minutes they actually had left to get it right. Nobody in that room yet knew the Admiral was about to remember her name from a very different emergency, 14 years and one ocean away from this one. Musculoskeletal back pain, likely from yard work, Dr. Wexford said. Already 3 sentences into a discharge summary he considered a formality. 68-year-old male. Hypertensive. Presents with sudden lower back pain radiating to the flank. Nothing on exam suggests anything more serious. Ibuprofen and rest. The ER had been running at capacity all morning. 4 other patients waiting on beds. A waiting room visible through the glass doors that made every attending on shift move a little faster than usual. Wexford, in particular, had been moving through discharges at a pace that left little room for second opinions from anyone, let alone a nurse he'd worked alongside for barely 3 months. Sophie Alarcon had been checking the patient's vitals when Wexford walked in, and she hadn't stopped checking them since. Pulse strength at each wrist. Blood pressure in both arms. The specific pattern she'd been trained to run through automatically whenever chest or back pain showed up in a patient over 60 with a cardiac history. His radial pulse is weaker on the right than the left, Sophie said, and his blood pressure's noticeably lower on that side too. That's a normal variant in plenty of patients, Wexford said, not looking up from his tablet. I don't need a pulse check to tell me a man who spent the morning gardening pulled a muscle in his back. A resident hovering near the doorway, taking notes for a chart he wasn't leading, glanced between Sophie and Wexford with the particular discomfort of someone watching a senior attending dismiss something that sounded, to his own untrained ear, uncomfortably specific. This isn't a pulled muscle presentation, Sophie said. Sudden onset. Tearing quality. Pulse and pressure differential between arms. That's a classic pattern for aortic dissection, not a strain. Wexford finally looked up. The expression of an attending being corrected by a nurse in front of a patient he considered beneath the need for a second opinion. I appreciate the enthusiasm, but I've been doing this 20 years. I think I can tell the difference between a torn muscle and a cardiac emergency. Wexford had built a reputation over those 20 years as the surgeon other doctors called when a case looked unsolvable. A status that had, somewhere along the way, calcified into a certainty that rarely left room for correction from anyone below his own rank. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was the arrogance of a man who'd been right often enough that being wrong had stopped feeling like a real possibility worth entertaining. I read 3 studies on exactly this presentation before I even started nursing school, Wexford added, loud enough for the resident to hear, performing a lesson for an audience of 1. I don't need a bedside pulse check to override that kind of training. Chart what you like, but I'm signing this discharge. The patient, Rear Admiral Daniel Bragg, retired, according to the chart, was pale and sweating despite the room's cool air. One hand pressed flat against his lower back like he was trying to hold something in place that had come loose. Feels like it's tearing, Bragg said, voice tight. Not pulled. Tearing. Wexford didn't look at him directly. Pain descriptions vary widely. Admiral, I promise you this is muscular. Sophie had seen this exact presentation once before. A lifetime ago. In a much smaller medical bay on a ship in the middle of an ocean with no CT scanner within 400 miles. And she'd learned then, in the worst possible way, how fast an aortic dissection could turn from a diagnosis someone dismissed into a diagnosis nobody survived. She pushed the memory down the way she always did, and stayed with the patient in front of her. I need you to order a CT angiogram before you sign that discharge, Sophie said. I'm not ordering an unnecessary scan because a nurse has a hunch, Wexford said, already moving toward the door. We have 4 other patients waiting on this bed. This isn't a hunch. It's a pattern I've seen kill someone in under an hour when it got missed. Wexford paused at the door, patience visibly thinning. If you want to file a formal concern with charge, that's your right. In the meantime, I have other patients." He left. Sophie stayed, watching Bragg's monitor with a focus that had nothing to do with the discharge paperwork sitting half-finished on the counter. The monitor's numbers held steady for 4 full minutes, long enough that Sophie almost let herself believe Wexford's read might somehow still be right, that she'd overreacted to a pattern that happened to look familiar without actually being the thing she feared. She checked Bragg's pulse again anyway, manually this time, both wrists at once, double-checking a read she badly wanted to be wrong about. It hadn't changed. If anything, the differential had grown slightly more pronounced in the last 4 minutes, a detail that told her exactly which direction this was actually moving. "You still with me?" she asked Bragg quietly. "Not going anywhere," he said, attempting something like a smile that didn't quite land given the sweat still beading along his hairline. 6 minutes later, Bragg's blood pressure dropped hard, 90/50. Then 84/46. The specific crash of a body whose largest blood vessel had just torn further than it had been torn 10 minutes earlier. His face had gone from pale to gray, sweat now beading along his hairline despite the room's cool air. "Something's wrong," Bragg said, voice thinner now. "Feels different. Worse." "I know," Sophie said, already hitting the call button and reaching for a second IV line without waiting for permission. "Stay with me. Don't move more than you have to." His breathing had gone shallow and fast, the particular rhythm of a body trying to compensate for blood pressure that was disappearing faster than his heart could account for it. Code Blue Prep. Bay 6. Possible aortic dissection with hypotension. Sophie called out, loud enough to carry down the hallway. Loud enough that Wexford, 3 rooms away, mid-sentence with another patient, stopped talking entirely. He came back into the room fast, and for 1/2 second his face carried something closer to alarm than the certainty he'd walked out with 6 minutes earlier. "Pressure's crashing," Sophie said, not waiting for him to ask. 84/46 and dropping. "I already paged cardiothoracic surgery and radiology. I need that CT angiogram run stat." "Not scheduled." "You paged surgery without my order?" "I paged surgery because he's dying," Sophie said. "You can write me up after he's stable." Wexford didn't argue further. There wasn't time to. And some instinct beyond his pride had finally caught up to the numbers on the monitor. "Get imaging moving. I want him prepped for the OR the second we confirm it." Bragg's oxygen saturation dipped as the team moved him, a second alarm joining the first, and for a few seconds the room held the chaos of a code responding to 2 problems at once: a collapsing blood vessel, and lungs that had started working harder to compensate for it. 91 and dropping, the monitor tech called out. 90. Non-rebreather. "Now," Sophie said, already reaching for the mask before anyone finished processing the number. "Watch it climb back once he's on full oxygen. If it doesn't, that changes what we're dealing with." It climbed back to 94 within a minute. Not proof of anything specific. But at least this didn't look like a separate respiratory catastrophe layering on top of everything else. One less unknown in a room that had far too many of them already. "He's tolerating the move," the transport tech called out, wheeling the gurney toward imaging at a near run. SAT's climbing back with the oxygen. Sophie stayed at Bragg's side the entire way, one hand on his wrist to track his pulse by feel, the other steadying the IV line against every jolt of the gurney's wheels over hallway seams. The CT confirmed it 11 minutes later. A Stanford type of dissection. The tear already extending further than it had been an hour earlier. Exactly the kind of emergency that turns fatal in the gap between a correct diagnosis and a delayed one. The radiologist reading the scan didn't mince words on the callback. "This is about as textbook as it gets. And about as time-sensitive. Get him to the OR now. Not after paperwork." Wexford's face, reading the same images over the radiologist's shoulder, had gone the shade of a man recalculating everything he'd said with total confidence 20 minutes earlier. He didn't apologize in the moment. There wasn't room for it. Not with a surgical team already moving Bragg toward the elevator. but something in his silence carried more weight than an apology would have. Bragg's hand found Sophie's wrist as the surgical team prepped to move him, his grip weaker than it should have been, but still deliberate. "Your voice," he said, eyes struggling to focus on her face. "I know your voice." He studied her for a moment longer, something surfacing behind the pain, fighting through 14 years of other faces and other names to find the right one. Sophie. Alarcon. Sophie's breath caught, hearing her own name land before anything else did. 14 years, Bragg said. USS Halloway. Petty Officer Reyes. Chest pain. Everyone said indigestion. "You didn't. You probably don't remember me," Sophie said, keeping her voice level even as her own pulse climbed. "It's been a long time." Sophie's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to remember the name, let alone the exact detail of it. 14 years and 100 other patients later. She remembered that night with a clarity that surprised her even now. The ship's medical bay lit by fluorescent tubes that buzzed faintly overhead. Reyes Gray faced on the exam table insisting he was fine. The ship's doctor already halfway through writing reflux antacids on the chart before Sophie had finished checking his second set of vitals. She'd walked the length of 3 passageways to find the captain in person. Because the ship's radio protocol would have taken longer than she believed Reyes actually had. "I was a junior contract nurse on that deployment," she said. "You were the captain. I told you Reyes needed a medevac, and the ship's doctor said I was overreacting to a case of heartburn. You didn't back down," Bragg said. "Made your case twice. I called for the helicopter myself, over the doc's objection." His grip tightened slightly, urgency breaking through the pain. "Reyes made it home to his kids because you didn't stop pushing. I never forgot that." The surgical team was already moving around them, prepping lines and calling out timing to the OR. And for a moment the whole hallway seemed to compress into the space between Sophie's hand and Bragg's. 14 years and one deteriorating aorta collapsing into the same 4 seconds. "I need you to save your strength now," Sophie said, throat tight in a way her voice didn't show. "You're the one who needs saving today. Then don't stop pushing this time either," Bragg said, "and let the surgical team take him from there." The resident, still standing near the doorway, had gone quiet through the entire exchange, watching something unfold that went well beyond anything his training had prepared him to categorize. He didn't say anything as the gurney rolled past him toward the elevator. He just watched Sophie's face for a long moment afterward, as if trying to reconcile the nurse Wexford had dismissed 20 minutes earlier with whatever he'd just witnessed happen between her and a retired admiral. The surgery took 4 hours. Bragg came out of it alive. The dissection repaired before it could rupture completely, a margin the surgeon later admitted had been measured in single-digit minutes, rather than any comfortable window. Sophie waited through all 4 hours in a break room she barely remembered walking into, coffee going cold in her hands, replaying the 6 minutes Wexford had spent walking away from a diagnosis that would have killed a man. If she'd simply accepted the word no, the way hospital hierarchy usually expected her to. The resident who'd witnessed the exchange found her there partway through the wait, still visibly unsettled by what he'd watched. "I've never seen anyone talk to Dr. Wexford like that," he admitted. "I didn't know you were allowed to." "I'm not, technically," Sophie said. "I did it anyway because the alternative was watching a man die of something I actually knew how to prevent." "Are you worried about what happens to you for going around him?" the resident asked. "I was more worried about what happens to the patient if I don't," Sophie said. "The rest usually sorts itself out, one way or another. It doesn't always sort itself out kindly, but it sorts itself out." He nodded slowly, filing the answer away the way residents file away the rare piece of advice that actually sounds true instead of just reassuring. "For what it's worth," he added, "I think you just changed how I'm going to handle the next attending who dismisses something I flag. I'm not going to just let it go quietly." "Good," Sophie said. "That's exactly the point." Wexford found her first, before Marsh did, standing awkwardly in the break room doorway like a man who'd rehearsed several versions of a sentence and liked none of them. "He's stable," Wexford said. Repair went clean. I know, Sophie said. I checked. He didn't leave right away. 20 years. And I've never had a nurse push back on a discharge that hard. I want to understand why you were that certain. Not just that you happened to be right. I wasn't guessing, Sophie said. I've seen this exact presentation kill someone before. In a place with far fewer resources than this hospital has. I know what it looks like when it's about to happen again. That's not something I knew about you, Wexford said, something unreadable moving behind his expression. Not quite an apology. Closer to a man recalculating the size of what he didn't know. You didn't ask, Sophie said. That's usually the actual problem, not the 20 years. He didn't have a response for that. He left without offering one. And Sophie didn't chase him for a better ending to the conversation than the one he'd given her. Dr. Elaine Marsh, chief of medicine, found her there once the surgical team confirmed Bragg was stable. I've read the full nursing note you filed, Marsh said. Pulse differential. Pain quality. The timeline of Dr. Wexford's discharge order versus your escalation. I want you to know this is going to a formal case review. Not a conversation that ends with an apology in a hallway. I wasn't trying to end anyone's career, Sophie said. I was trying to keep a patient alive. I understand that, Marsh said, but this is his second missed dissection flagged in a chart review this year. And the first one got caught by someone with considerably less standing to push back than you had. He's being placed on mandatory supervised practice pending a full review of his discharge decisions for the last 6 months. Has this happened before? Sophie asked. With other nurses? Twice that I know of, informally. Marsh said. Neither one got written up the way you wrote this one up. The pattern only becomes visible when someone actually puts it on paper. Were you scared, pushing back on him like that? Marsh asked. Terrified. Sophie admitted. I did it anyway because the alternative was watching a man I recognized from 14 years ago die of something I actually knew how to prevent. That's the answer I was hoping for, Marsh said. Doing the right thing in this building still sometimes costs something, even when it shouldn't. Pretending it doesn't helps nobody prepare for the next time it happens. Sophie didn't feel triumphant hearing it. She felt, mostly, exhausted. The kind that comes after holding a line for 6 straight minutes against someone who outranked her on paper, and had been wrong the entire time. Sophie visited Bragg in recovery 3 days later. Once he was lucid enough for a real conversation instead of a few traded sentences on a gurney. He looked smaller than he had in the ambulance bay. Years of command presence usually gave men like him tubes and monitors, reducing a Rear Admiral to the same vulnerable posture as anyone else recovering from open heart surgery. They tell me I owe you my life twice now, Bragg said, voice still rough, but steady. 14 years apart. That's an unusual thing to have in common with someone. You made the actual call both times, Sophie said. I just gave you the information. On the Holloway, I had a ship's doctor with more rank than you telling me it was nothing. Bragg said. Here, I had a physician with more letters after his name telling me the same thing. Both times. The person who was actually right was the one with the least authority to override anybody. That happens more than people want to admit, Sophie said. I know it does, Bragg said. Spent 30 years in the Navy learning that rank and correctness aren't the same thing nearly as often as people assume. Should have remembered that faster in that ER bay. Given I'd already learned the lesson once from you personally. He shifted against the pillows, wincing slightly at the movement, and looked at her with the directness of a man used to giving orders who was choosing, deliberately, not to give one now. Can I ask you something? Why nursing? After the Navy contract ended, you clearly had the instincts for something with more rank attached to it. I thought about it, Sophie admitted. Officer training, a longer career track. I decided I'd rather be the person actually standing at the bedside than the person 3 ranks removed from it. Rank protects you from consequences. It doesn't always keep you close enough to the patient to catch the thing that matters. That's a philosophy most people don't arrive at until much later in a career, if they ever do. Bragg said. I arrived at it on the Holloway, Sophie admitted. Watching how fast Rank could get between a patient and the person who actually noticed something was wrong. I decided I didn't want that kind of distance in my own career, no matter what it cost me in advancement. Most people would call that a sacrifice. Bragg said. Most days it doesn't feel like one. Sophie said. Today especially. That's a harder path. Bragg said. Most days. Sophie agreed. Today it worked out. Not every day does. How many days doesn't it? Bragg asked. Quieter now. Sophie considered the question honestly before answering it. More than I'd like. Most of them don't end in a headline moment either way. A doctor quietly changes an order after I push. Or doesn't. And either way nobody outside that room ever hears about it. Today's just the rare one where the stakes happened to line up with someone remembering my name from 14 years ago. Then I'm glad I was the rare one. Bragg said. Selfishly. Bragg was quiet for a moment. Eyes drifting toward the window. Some memory working its way back to the surface. There was a moment on the Holloway I never told you about, he said. After the helicopter took off with Reyes. I stood on that flight deck and thought about how close I'd come to trusting the wrong voice in that room. Rank doesn't teach you humility. It teaches you confidence. Those aren't the same skill, and I didn't fully understand the difference until that night. You made the right call anyway, Sophie said, because you gave me a reason to doubt the easy answer. Bragg said, that's worth more than people usually credit it for. He studied her for a moment, something more than gratitude in his expression now. I'm going to make sure the hospital board hears exactly how this went. Start to finish. Not because you need the credit. Because the next nurse who tries to push back against a doctor with more letters after his name deserves to know it's happened before. And it mattered. I'd appreciate that, Sophie said, and meant it more plainly than she'd meant most things in longer than she wanted to admit. One more thing, Bragg said, before she left. Reyes, the sailor from the Holloway. You said he made it home to his kids. You ever hear from him after that? Once, Sophie said. A letter. About 6 months later. Good man, if memory serves. Bragg said. Glad to know it stuck for both of you. Whatever it was worth. It was worth a lot. Sophie said. More than I let on to most people who ask. Sophie drove home that evening with the particular quiet that follows a day spent holding a line she hadn't been sure, in the moment, she'd actually win. She thought about Reyes, the sailor from 14 years ago, and wondered, the way she sometimes still did on nights like this one, whether he'd made it all the way home to those kids Bragg had mentioned. Whether he ever knew how close the ship's doctor had come to writing his chest pain off as nothing at all. She still had the letter he'd sent her, 6 months after the medevac, thanking her in the plain language of a man who wasn't used to writing thank you notes, and had meant every word of it anyway. He'd described his daughter's face when he walked through the door, still healing. Still alive. A moment he said he'd have missed entirely if a nurse half his rank hadn't refused to let a diagnosis get buried under someone else's certainty. She'd kept it folded in the same drawer for 14 years. Taken out on the handful of nights when the job made her question whether pushing back against people who outranked her was actually worth what it cost. The written-up complaints. The cold shoulders from doctors who didn't appreciate being corrected. The loneliness of being right in a system that didn't always reward it quickly. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could easily count, she didn't need to take it out to remember the answer. Her phone buzzed once as she pulled into her driveway. A message from Marsh. Short and factual. Wexford's review is moving forward. Wanted you to hear it from me before it hits the rumor mill tomorrow. Sophie read it twice, then set the phone down without responding right away. It wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't satisfaction either. It was something closer to the particular stillness of watching a system finally do, slowly and imperfectly, the thing it was actually supposed to do all along. She sat in the car in her own driveway a few extra minutes before going inside, letting the day settle the way it needed to. 14 years ago, on a ship in open water. She'd been 26 years old and terrified of what it would cost her contract to keep pushing a captain past a doctor's diagnosis. Today, she was 40. and still felt some version of that same fear every time she opened her mouth to correct someone with more letters after their name. The fear never fully went away, she'd learned. It just got easier to ACT through IT anyway. Inside, she found the letter exactly where she always kept it. Read it once more by the kitchen light, and for the first time in 14 years, decided to do something about it she'd never quite worked up the nerve to do before. She wrote Reyes a letter of her own, short, simple, telling him that his captain had ended up in her ER 14 years later, and had remembered both their names the entire time. She didn't know if the address she had was still good. She sent it anyway, because some debts were worth trying to close even after this many years, and some good news deserved a chance to actually reach the person it belonged to. 3 weeks later, a reply came back, a single page. The same plain handwriting she remembered from 14 years ago. A little shakier now, but unmistakably his. He'd read her letter twice. He wrote, and then read it to his wife, who'd cried harder than he had. Sophie read it standing in her kitchen, the same way she'd read his first letter 14 years earlier, and let herself feel fully and without hurrying past it. Exactly how much one refusal to accept, it's probably nothing, could still be quietly rippling outward more than a decade later. She tucked his new letter into the same drawer, folded beside the old one, and for the first time in 14 years, closed IT without checking whether either one was still there. Being right and being believed are two different battles, and the second one is often harder to win than the first. If someone in your life has ever pushed back against authority to protect you, it's worth telling them plainly that it mattered, because most of them never expect to hear it.